Imagine screaming for your life in the middle of a freezing mountain pass, and the people who hear you are so terrified, they turn off their headlights and walk directly into a blizzard. In 1978, 5 young men abandoned a perfectly working car, ignored a dying man's cries for help, and marched 20 miles into the pitch-black darkness. Months later, one of them was found starved to death inside a cabin, surrounded by a year's supply of untouched food. They weren't lost, they were running from something. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only deep within the winter woods. It is a silence so absolute, it feels heavy. It swallows sound, it disorients the mind, and it hides secrets beneath layers of impenetrable freezing white. In the Plumas National Forest of Northern California, the winter of 1978 was exceptionally brutal. The snowdrifts were waist-high, freezing the landscape into a desolate, inaccessible void. It wasn't until June 4th, when the ice finally began to yield to the spring sun, that a small group of off-road motorcyclists ventured up a remote, high-elevation dirt path, nearly 20 miles from the nearest paved road. In a place completely isolated from the rest of the world, they stumbled upon a dilapidated Forest Service trailer. One of its windows had been smashed in. When they stepped inside, the air was heavy with the stagnant, unmistakable scent of death. On a single, rusty spring cot lay the body of a man. He was meticulously, tightly swaddled from head to toe in 8 separate sheets, as if someone had desperately tried to cocoon him against the freezing air. It was Ted Wire. He was 32 years old, but his body was completely unrecognizable. He had lost nearly 100 pounds. His feet were severely destroyed by frostbite and gangrene. The coroner would later determine a terrifying truth. Ted had not died quickly. He had survived inside this uninsulated metal box for anywhere from 8 to 13 agonizing weeks before his body finally gave out. But it wasn't just the body that chilled investigators to the bone. It was the surrounding environment. It was the choices that were made inside that room. Just feet away from the bed, exactly 36 cans of military C rations had been opened and consumed, yet right next to them, inside an unlocked storage shed, sat a literal mountain of dehydrated meals and canned food, enough sustenance to easily feed 5 grown men for an entire year. It was completely untouched. On a table next to the bed sat paperback books, paper, and matches. Just feet away was a heavy forestry fireplace complete with chopped wood. Outside the trailer, an industrial propane tank was fully connected to the heating system, requiring nothing more than the turn of a valve. None of it had been used. The fire had never been lit. The heat was never turned on. Why would someone choose to endure the absolute mind-breaking agony of starving and freezing to death in the pitch black when salvation was resting right in the palm of their hands? This is not just a story about getting lost in the woods. This is a descent into an inexplicable psychological nightmare. This is the Yuba County Five. To understand the sheer madness of that trailer, we have to rewind the clock by 4 months to a night that began with absolute mundane normalcy. February 24th, 1978, Yuba City, California. 5 young men were preparing for the most exciting weekend of their lives. Jack Madruga, 30, Bill Sterling, 29, Ted Wire, 32, Jack Hewitt, 24, and Gary Mathias, 25 years old. In their community, they were lovingly known simply as the Boys. They were inseparable best friends, with the exception of Gary Mathias, who was an Army veteran managing schizophrenia with medication. The other 4 men had mild intellectual disabilities. They lived at home with their parents, they relied on their families, and they thrived on strict, unbreakable daily routines. Together they formed the starting lineup of the Gateway Gators, a basketball team representing a local vocational center. The very next morning they were scheduled to play in a major Special Olympics-sponsored tournament. The grand prize was a free week-long trip to Los Angeles. To say they were excited would be an understatement. They had talked of nothing else for weeks. Before leaving the house that evening, some of the boys had already laid out their basketball uniforms on their beds, completely prepared to wake up early and win. But first, they wanted to celebrate in advance by watching a college basketball game. They piled into Jack Madruga's prized possession, a pristine turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. Madruga loved this car. He maintained it perfectly, and he never, under any circumstances, let anyone else drive it. They drove 50 miles north to UC Davis, watched the game, and enjoyed their night. The game wrapped up around 10 p.m. On their way back, they stopped at Bears Market in downtown Chico. The clerk remembered them vividly. They bought a Hostess cherry pie, a lemon drop pie, a Snickers bar, a Dallas Cowboys pennant, and a few sodas. At 10:30 p.m., they walked out of the store, climbed back into the Mercury Montego, and drove off into the darkness. The route back to Yuba City should have been incredibly simple. A straight, flat, familiar 50-mile drive down Highway 99. They never arrived. By sunrise, the parents were frantic. These were men who simply did not deviate from their routines. None of them would willingly miss their championship game. The families contacted the police, and a massive search effort was immediately launched. But for 3 excruciating days, the earth seemed to have swallowed the 5 men and the turquoise car whole. Then, on February 28th, a park ranger made a discovery that shattered every logical assumption. 70 miles away from Chico, deep inside the treacherous freezing wilderness of the Plumas National Forest, the Mercury Montego was found abandoned on a rugged, high-elevation dirt path known as the Oroville-Quincy Road. The location was an absolute geographical paradox. They had driven in the complete opposite direction of their home. The families were adamant. None of the boys liked the outdoors. They didn't hike, they didn't camp, and they were terrified of the dark. Yet here was Jack Madruga's beloved car, sitting at an elevation of 4,400 feet, surrounded by deep snowdrifts. Investigators assumed the car had gotten stuck, forcing the men to walk to find help, but when police examined the vehicle, a profound sense of unease washed over them. The Montego wasn't trapped. 5 grown men could have easily pushed it backward out of the minor snowdrift it was resting in. In fact, police turned the ignition and the car started immediately. The engine ran flawlessly. The gas tank was a quarter full. Inside the cabin, investigators found the wrappers from the snacks bought at Bears Market neatly folded. The keys were missing. And most disturbing of all, one of the windows was rolled down, exposing the pristine interior to the freezing mountain blizzard. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle. The undercarriage of the car was completely undamaged, lacking the dents or mud that would suggest a frantic, reckless drive up the mountain. Whoever navigated that treacherous dirt road in the pitch black did so carefully, deliberately, and with immense skill. Why abandon a perfectly functioning heated shelter to walk directly into a freezing wilderness, wearing only light windbreakers, jeans, and low-top sneakers? The only clue to what happened on that road came from a 55-year-old man named Joseph Schontz, and his testimony elevated this case from a tragic mystery into a terrifying psychological thriller. That exact same night, Schontz had been driving up the Oroville-Quincy Road to check the snowline for an upcoming ski trip. His car got hopelessly stuck in the snow. While trying to physically push it out, Schontz suffered a mild heart attack. Immobilized by searing chest pain, he crawled back into his freezing car, hoping for a miracle. Around 11:30 p.m., that miracle seemingly arrived. Schontz saw headlights pull up behind him. He heard the distinctive sound of car doors opening and slamming shut. Looking through his rear view window, he saw a group of figures standing in the glow of the headlights. Schontz even claimed he saw a woman holding a baby among them, a detail that has never been explained. Desperate for his life, Schontz forced his car door open and screamed into the dark for help. The moment he yelled, the voices instantly went dead. The headlights were immediately switched off. The figures melted silently into the trees. Jones retreated to his car, terrified. Hours later, he claimed he saw flashlight beams cutting through the trees outside his window and heard muted voices again. He called out a second time. Once again, the lights went completely dark. The crushing silence of the forest returned. Jones survived the night and walked down the mountain the next morning. He walked right past the abandoned Mercury Montego. Whatever the boys encountered on that road, whatever compelled them to turn off their lights and completely ignore the desperate, pleading cries of a dying man, it terrified them enough to march directly into the freezing unknown. Because of the severe winter storms, the search grid was repeatedly buried in fresh snow, forcing investigators to halt their efforts. The families were left in an agonizing purgatory of unanswered questions. It wasn't until June that the ice finally thawed, leading the motorcyclists to the trailer and Ted Wire's emaciated body. But the horror was far from over. That trailer was located a staggering 19.4 miles uphill from where the car was abandoned. Let that sink in. 5 men wearing thin jackets and sneakers walked nearly 20 miles uphill in the dead of night through snowdrifts that were frequently waist deep. Following the discovery of the trailer, searchers fanned out into the woods. The next day, the skeletal remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found on the opposite side of the road, about halfway between the car and the trailer. They had died on that horrific trek up the mountain. 2 days later, Jack Hewitt's remains were found scattered in the brush just 2 miles away from the trailer, but Gary Matthias was nowhere to be found. The physical bodies had been recovered, but the psychological puzzle of the Yuba County Five remains entirely, frustratingly unsolved. Ted Wire's feet were so badly destroyed by frostbite that he could not have possibly walked the final distance to the trailer, nor could he have survived in that bed alone. There was another person in that metal box with him, someone who cared enough to tuck the sheets tightly around his freezing body and open those sea rations. All evidence points to Gary Matthias. Matthias was the only one with military survival training. Inside the trailer, investigators found Gary's tennis shoes. They also found a heavy piece of wood that had been used to smash the trailer window to gain entry. But the survival decisions made inside that cabin defy all human comprehension. Psychologists have suggested that their mild intellectual disabilities, combined with the sheer, blinding terror of the situation, may have caused them to rigidly stick to societal rules. They may have believed the massive stockpile of food belonged to someone else, and they were terrified of being punished for stealing. They may have believed that lighting a fire in the fireplace would create smoke, attracting the attention of whatever it was they were running from. But what were they running from? The theories are as dark and tangled as the forest itself. Did they witness something they weren't supposed to see at Bear's Market in Chico? Were they chased up that mountain road by someone who intended to make sure they never came back down? Is that why they killed their headlights when Joseph Shons yelled for help because they thought the killer had finally found them? Or did the ultimate threat come from within? Gary Matthias had missed his schizophrenia medication. Did the stress of the dark drive trigger a severe psychotic break? Did he hallucinate a threat, commandeer the car, and lead his trusting, vulnerable friends up the mountain in a misguided, tragic attempt to save them? At some point during those brutal weeks, Gary Matthias took Ted Wire's heavy leather shoes, leaving his own sneakers behind in the trailer. He stepped out the door, walked into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Plumas National Forest, and vanished. Not a single trace of him, Not a scrap of clothing, not a bone has ever been found. 5 best friends went up a mountain they had absolutely no reason to be on. 4 came back in body bags. 1 became a ghost. The Yuba County Five remains a haunting testament to the extreme fragility of the human. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the invisible forces we run from in the dark. What were they truly running from out there in the freezing dark? Were they being hunted by a physical threat or by the invisible monsters conjured by their own minds? Let me know your theories in the comments below.